So the difference here is this is just white flour, and what turns it into bread is microbes, and it's most of the metabolisms that run the carbon cycle are microbial metabolisms. Microbes are the critical workers, if you will, in the carbon cycle. By metabolisms, I mean they take in material, gases, and liquids, and they breathe out carbon dioxide, and that's what we do as well. But the microbes do far more of it than we do. This is the picture that emerged for me after 15 years of measuring carbon and studying the carbon cycle. And I'll start on the right. Here's fossil fuel burning. We all know that produces atmospheric carbon dioxide. But the major flows of carbon are pretty invisible to most of us. There's a huge flow that comes into green plants on land. It feeds microbes. The microbes do a lot of respiration. They eat it. They eat this carbon and use it for habitat. And a lot of that goes back up into the atmosphere. That's what they call soil respiration. And we're part of that too. When we breathe out, this is part of the return leg of the land-based carbon cycle. This is a huge annual flow, very fast. Enormous volumes of carbon and carbon dioxide come into the soil, are processed by microbes that generate the snot, slimes, and glues that hold the mineral particles of soil together. And then almost all of that is exhausted back into the air. This little arrow here acknowledges the fact that soil respiration feeds the underside, the stomata of dense plant canopies. So in some cases, the carbon cycle is pretty tight, close to the ground. The soil air in the surface layers of the soil is largely carbon dioxide because of soil respiration from microbes. There's another, and by the way, this is dissolved carbon running down rivers into the oceans. There's quite a bit of that. The second loop here is a solubility loop. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater in the same way that if you want to carbonate a soda drink, you can pump carbon dioxide into the layer of gas above the liquid, and you'll force carbonization into the liquid, which is slightly acid. And that's why, because the oceans are absorbing quite a bit of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the oceans are turning a little bit more acid. But there's also a reverse part of this. Again, it's a solubility thing. In the same way that a carbonated beverage, if you leave the cap off, will go flat. The carbon dioxide will come out of solution into the gas above. And there's an equilibration here. In other words, to use technical language, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide above the liquid will equilibrate or balance with the dissolved concentration of carbon dioxide in the seawater. And again, this is mediated in many big ways by microbes. The free-floating photosynthetic algae in the ocean that are responsible for half the photosynthesis on Earth they're incredibly numerous in the sea. And some of them result in food chains that deposit things like calcium carbonate on the sea floor, and that becomes part, with subduction and so forth, that becomes part of the geologic carbon cycle that sometimes results in carbon dioxide coming out of volcanoes or fissures or from the rocks. And so this connects all this to deep lithospheric carbon. This is a very much slower, less intense cycle than the biological and the solubility loops here. I spent a lot of time monitoring and measuring this, a fairly small part. You might say a bit of a transect across that, looking at soil carbon and soil carbon change in soils down to about 16, 20 inches usually with hand tools. This whole cycle is run by sunlight, and we're part of it. We're not external to it. And it's nested within many other loops of solar energy, and I'll try to quickly describe these. Of the sunlight that hits the top of the atmosphere, about a third is reflected. The rest, a lot of it is absorbed as heat running winds and currents. Some of it evaporates water, which runs the water cycle, which is a huge use of solar energy, about 400 horsepower per acre on average. Carbon cycle is a tiny bit of that. And that results in behavior and cognition in all organisms, respiration, consciousness, and maybe even self-awareness. So we have this is an incredible nested arrangement of sunlight energy. And so this is an unbelievably complex, mysterious, beautiful picture. And it cuts across every human concern. As I said, we're inside of it, trying to figure it out, and we're not external looking at it. And there's an incredible number of nested relationships here it's almost an infinite continuum, if you will, of sunlight energy that's running my voice, my emotions, as well as your thoughts, feelings, everything about us is running by solar energy through the carbon cycle or circle of life. However, this is kind of tough to understand, and we have a lot of areas of ignorance. Microbes are incredibly diverse. Things are being found out about what goes on in the soil every year, as well as the ocean. And all these nested relationships, the relationship with the water cycle, with the nitrogen cycle, with the sulfur cycle, incredibly complex. But ingenious humans have been able to turn this fantastic, complex, nested picture of relationships into a simple problem. Next slide, please. We've turned it into the climate problem. And this is now considered by many people the problem of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we've been tracking that, and it's rising fairly fast. And this problem is portrayed now as a balance scale, with fossil fuel emissions on one side and sequestration or drawdown by green plants, for example, and also technology such as carbon capture mechanisms and so forth on the other side. And the balance here is measured in CO2 tons. And we predict or estimate the effects of practices here with models, and sometimes use measurement as well. but typically widely scattered or low numbers of samples. And this, of course, we can use simple chemical accounting to figure out how much carbon dioxide is released in the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning, although methane leaks from fracked gas operations are usually not connected or not counted here, and they're kind of hard to track. This problem offers a lot of opportunity versus the more complex picture on the other side. It enables entrepreneurs, profit seekers to package an amount of carbon that's presumed to be sequestered and sell it as an offset to people who are, or companies who are doing a lot of carbon emissions in an attempt to do a balance or offset or a credit or something like that. So it enables a market transaction to take place. And this is further enhanced by the fact that our government is doing very little to actually regulate this. So there's a bigger opportunity for sale of packaging and sale of an offset. It also enables us to think that we're solving the problem of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causing climate change. And it enables us to feel like we're doing good. And a lot of people involved in carbon offsets and carbon trading and so forth, there's some very well-intentioned people. I don't mean to disrespect people's intentions, but just remember that we've turned a very complex situation into a simple problem here. And that gives us the opportunity to sell offsets, to maybe solve the problem or appear to like we're solving the problem, and to do what a lot of people think is a good thing. But there's been a tremendous amount of pushback against the offset thing. The TV personality John Oliver did a piece last year, and Angel, I don't have a link for that, but that was a powerful hit piece on carbon offsets. And he ended with planting a tree in his yard and holding an axe over it and said, if you don't pay me, I'm going to chop this tree down. And there's been a lot of pushback, particularly against carbon offsets in tropical forests. There's been an amazing amount of corruption and not good things happening with that. And some people would say that this is profiteering. Carbon offsets are profiteering disguised as emissions reduction. Recent articles in the Guardian paper, for example, report that up to 90% of tropical forest carbon offsets are fraudulent or non-existent. Pretty high percentage. So a lot of the packagers and sellers of carbon offsets are trying to defend their operation. As I said, many of them are well-intentioned. They want to do good. And one of the defenses is that, okay, since government isn't regulating this at all, or not much in the United States anyway, we need to do something because it's an emergency. We have a climate emergency. We're helping producers adopt beneficial practices. And for example, Western Sustainability Exchange with its native energy program makes that a big selling point. We can help ranchers with fencing and water development so they can develop more paddocks, and our models show that will tend to increase soil carbon, and you might be able to get paid for that. And a lot of the carbon offset stuff is, can we add integrity? because there's been a lot of pushback. And there's big commissions now trying to add layers of integrity and oversight to the pretty much free-for-all carbon offset market as it's been going on so far. We're using different words. It's not an offset, it's storage, for example, what some people would say. But the basic fact is that the demand for what's packaged here is accounted for in terms of CO2 tons. And whether you call it an offset or storage or something, there's still that balanced paradigm that the transaction is based on. And in addition, there's a considerable effort. There's an outfit called the Integrated Exchange Network, I think it is called, or Integral Exchange Network. I'm blanking a little bit on the title, that wants to put a natural asset company. They want to commodify, privatize all ecosystem services into what is called natural asset companies and sell them or trade them on the New York Stock Exchange, predicted for this fall. Some of my Indian friends say that this is amounts to a privatization of the air. And if you can make these tradable, it opens the door for financialization of all of nature, which a lot of people are very much against. So my picture of carbon offsets, you see, is fairly negative. I do think it's a scam or a con, but it also brings benefits. It can also bring benefits to ranchers. And one way it can do that is, as I mentioned, Western Sustainability Exchange and others can help pay for infrastructure and fencing. And so you get money for that. But remember also that the landowner who has very low carbon, compacted, degraded soil also gets money from the drought pasture foraging and the drought program, and also farmers get crop insurance subsidies. So there's payments on both sides. But one of the alternatives, possible alternatives to carbon offsets to gain money, to gain investment in your operation, can be NRCS programs, for example, that don't involve the offsets or the potentially fraudulent scam carbon offsets. For example, in Vermont, I listened to some colleagues of mine in the Soil Carbon Coalition. They're developing a add-on program to the Conservation Stewardship Program, to the CSP program, to make it easier for farmers and ranchers to get payments, and sometimes get payments ahead of implementing practices or improvements. And it's not dependent on the sale of offset or potentially fraudulent or crooked sale of offsets. And I think the moral dilemma of offsets, and I'm going to try to make an analogy here. If I'm walking down the street in my small town and I see somebody in a wheelchair trying to get up over a curb, and I'm reasonably able-bodied, I have the ability to help them get over that curb. But if some known scam artist were to offer to pay me to help that person get over the curb, in other words, pay me to do good, I would feel pretty queasy about that. But on the other hand, money is money, and it might help me do things I need to do. So it's a little bit of a fractured situation here. And I guess I'm ready to open the chat. How would you feel about that? How would you feel about some known scam artist or somebody who's got money in a somewhat dishonest way paying you to do good? How do you feel about that?
Okay, so that's the question that Peter is posing to you, and Angel will put that question in the chat so that you can kind of remember it. But he says, I've described carbon credits as a scam or a con that might pay you to do good or invest in your operation. How do you feel about this bargain, and might there be alternatives? So Angel now is going to break you into some smaller breakout rooms where you can discuss that question amongst yourselves, and we'll bring you back here in about 10 minutes. And then you'll be posting your answers into the chat, and we'll have that discussion with Peter.
Just one second.
There he is. Hello, Peter. So one group got to have Peter in your room for that discussion. So that's kind of a fun little perk to that breakout room. But as we now get into this next portion of tonight's webinar, go ahead and after we got that question posed to us and you guys were able to speak about it, kind of give me some of your feedback in the chats, and we'll chat with Peter about that. So again, his question was that I've described carbon credits as a scam or a con that might pay you to do good or invest in your operation. How do you feel about this bargain, and might there be alternatives? And I guess, Peter, as we wait for those questions to pop up, one of the things that I had come up in my mind is that, like with all things, there's probably some companies that are better than others. And so if you were going to take this step and enter into that carbon market picture, do you have any tips maybe that people might look out for, or some advice on choosing a company to work with?
Well, in Montana, there's probably only about 3 or 4 companies currently offering carbon credits, and I'm sure Tara would have a better idea of who they are, but I know that's the Western Sustainability Exchange, Grassroots Carbon, Ogoro, and is it the Regen Network or something? I'm not really sure, but their programs differ, and what I would advise people to look at is the commitments and risks that are involved. And they're probably changing. I think this is a situation that's changing a lot. As many people know, the Chicago Climate Exchange is one of the first players in this sphere in the early 2000s, and they had a trading platform where you could trade carbon credits, and of course these were modeled on practices, of course, not measured, and they finally quit when the price per ton went down to something like 25 cents or 50 cents or something. There was very little demand at that time. People predict different demand scenarios. Some people predict that demand is going to crater because of all this pushback and companies are being publicly embarrassed for purchasing these kinds of, in some cases, fraudulent or low quality offsets. And some other people think that this is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar market. And so there's going to be a lot of change, and I would definitely look at the risks and what you might have to pay back, or if you could, what are the circumstances for getting out of it. And in some cases, you might have to repay the sampling costs of $10 an acre to get out of it. to get out of a contract.
And Tara commented that those are the ones that she's aware of as well. We had a couple of groups or a couple of individuals asking the same question here, and that they're really curious about what alternatives might be out there.
Well, I've mentioned the NRCS EQIP and conservation stewardship programs, and those didn't, in comparison to quote unquote climate smart agriculture, they didn't get a lot of new funding in the Inflation Reduction Act that just came through. But as I mentioned, the Vermont legislature was interested in the whole concept of payment for ecosystem services. So they convened a working group, and some of my fellow board members of the Soil Carbon Coalition were on it. And after 3 years, the working group came up with a consensus recommendation that the state should adapt and strengthen the conservation stewardship program in Vermont. So it's not an offset, but they help pay people to do good things. And I think that is because many people understand that this is an emergency. We need to do something. We need to do something effective. But the measurement might not be just in CO2 tons of offsets. They might be in increased slowing down the water cycle, for example, with increased soil health and porosity and aggregation.
So Peter, one question posed, we just talked about some of the more government programs that could be used as alternatives, but how could a local group like Ranchers Stewardship Alliance engage in this process?
Well, I think that's a great question. One of the things that I've been aware of with the big picture of the carbon cycle is that it tends to ask questions that are locally approved. And by the way, Rick asked me to talk a little bit about soil microbiology, which I think I did, but understanding soil tests. For example, the Soil Health Institute correctly understands that the key thing is the work of the microbes. And what they recommend for soil tests is soil respiration, Haney test. In other words, the amount of CO2 that the microbes are putting off. This has to do with the work that they're doing. Okay. Another test would be what's their food and habitat, and that could be something like measuring soil organic carbon, because that's both the food and the habitat for a lot of soil microbes. The third thing is what is the results of their work, and that is soil aggregation. And that can be pretty well approximated by an infiltration test, which I'm a big fan of, an infiltration test. In other words, if you want to understand soil tests, ask your own questions. And very many complicated soil tests are almost impossible to understand. Rick led the RMG group on excuse me. We did some biological soil tests with microbial analyses and things like that. And it was difficult for us to understand, what the relevance of various types of nematode counts and stuff like that were. So it's better if you ask your own questions. And sometimes trace elements, which are very important, and they're not covered by the soil health principles, which I talked in one of our breakout groups. Soil health principles are in many ways the enabling conditions for microbial activity: cover, diversity, minimize tillage, living roots, integrate livestock, and know the context. Those are the enabling conditions for, and if you're short trace elements of boron or molybdenum, those can be very important. However, sometimes soil tests and forage analyses might differ on that. And so the solution is safe to fail trials, because a lot of people selling bugs in a jug and inoculants and different things like that. So that's a bit of an aside, but Rick did ask me to address that at least briefly when he asked me to do this.
So, Peter, I hate to think of the 1990s as being 30 years ago, but they very much well were. As you are looking back to your work that you started in the 90s to where we're at today, what are the biggest changes? What are the biggest aha moments that you've had along that journey?
Well, I think I've shared some of them to realize how many people are still stuck in this simple model, if you will, and trying to adjust into that. And what this simple balance model of emissions and sequestration is what the whole concept of offsets, or in some cases payment for ecosystem services, is based on. But it's also what the carbon market and payment for ecosystem services bandwagons are currently high centered on. Does that make sense? Because this doesn't match reality. And people try to add things, what's the relationship with water, what's the relationship with community, profitability, all those things. And it's hard to do with this simple model because you're ignoring lots of relationships. It's tunnel vision. And so realizing how slow things change and how fast things change, sometimes, an overnight success is 20 years in the making. Seeing these things happen. In fact, just yesterday, I saw that Vermont report come out. Whether the legislature will follow it or not is another question, but there's a lot of good thinking behind that. And so the alternatives are, I think, possible, but in terms of marketing a commodity on a global basis, that's probably not the right question. And I guess one of the big things I have is what would enable a local market? In other words, can we hire ranchers to build deep water absorbing topsoil? And what's the implication of that for our communities, our whole economy, and everything like that? For example, in California, where I'm heading in a couple of days, with all the rains they've had, the grazing lands are an incredibly important feature of the water cycle. Can they absorb and retain water? Can they transmit water to do aquifer recharge? All these things are incredibly important versus just letting the water slide off and cause this kind of thing.
All right, a couple more comments. We've got Linda Poole says the approach of using NRCS programs to fund good work on soil health rather than using money from carbon offsets for funding has been in place for several years in California. The process is now being extended to Colorado, New Mexico, and South Dakota does some of this as well. Montana NRCS conservation districts and various nonprofits in Montana are exploring the same approach, but it's not in place yet. And if you like this approach, please tell your local NRCS office. Any parting thoughts from you, Peter, before we let you go tonight? I know you've been talking for an hour straight here, so your voice is given out on you. We're very, very grateful to have you for the evening.
Well, I don't know what the answer is in terms of what RSA or local groups can do. I'm encouraged by what the Rangeland Monitoring Group in the Muscle Shell Plains in Garfield Petroleum County have been doing, and we're hoping, I'm working with them to extend that to north of the river and so forth, if we can get a little bit more funding for it. the focus on monitoring and a combination of professional consultant monitoring with rancher infiltration tests, for example, or questions that ranchers are interested in asking and answering. In other words, I think in order to make progress, we need to ask somewhat different questions than how can I get paid for my carbon offsets?
All right, Peter. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to the folks that participated.